over the dark night. She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star.
Welcome back. Good afternoon. And well, after a whole lot of hoopla in kabuki theater, Trump's big boondoggle finally became law. Did Trump achieve what conservatives have been trying to achieve for decades? And notice I said conservatives, not Republicans, conservatives. Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. You know, each show here, my guests and I, we try to provide insight and analysis into current events by looking at the broader historical context in which most events take place. Let's quickly look at some of today's headlines. Trump and Netanyahu are scheduled to have dinner this evening at the White House. Trump seems to believe that this current so-called truce between Israel and Hamas could pave the way for a greater peace in the Middle East. I think Trump is delusional and putting the cart before the horse. Trump has announced a 25% tariff on goods from Japan and South Korea. Today, he posted letters to the leaders of Japan and South Korea, informing them that he plans to impose a 25% tariff on their exports to the United States. And, you know, I thought that everybody was supposed to be clamoring and breaking down the doors to do deals with us. And so far, that has not occurred. You know, this reminds me of a line from The Godfather, where Don Corleone is talking to Tom Hayden, explaining who put the hit on Sonny. And in talking about one of his rivals, the Don famously states, Tartaglia is a pimp. He never could have outfought Santino, implying that Tartaglia was not smart enough or powerful enough or respected enough in the mafia world. I think that applies to Don. We'll leave it there. Trump threatens extra tariffs on BRICS, on the BRICS-aligned countries. He says that nations that support the group's anti-American policies would face an additional 10% tariff. He did not elaborate. What does this guy think he's doing? Running some kind of extortion racket? Remember, again, when he told us that all of these deals were going to get done, countries were flocking to our shores to negotiate with us, and this is all you got to show so far? What a waste. All right. On today's episode, the issue before us, after a whole lot of hoopla and kabuki theater, Donald Trump's big boondoggle, his massive transference of wealth, has finally become law. Did he achieve what conservatives have been trying to achieve for decades? My guest is a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he taught economics from 1973 to 2008. He's currently a visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs of the New School University in New York City. He's the author of a number of books. The latest, I think, is Understanding Capitalism. Dr. Richard Wolff, as always, welcome back.
Thank you very, very much. I really enjoyed talking with you, Wilmer. We've been doing it for a while now, and it gets better with age, as I'm sure both you and I are doing as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that compliment. I greatly appreciate it. And I think one of the reasons why the conversations get better is because I get smarter every time I talk to you.
Me too.
Let me start. But I was going to start with a question about this attack on working class immigrants. But before I get there, your thoughts on this whole 25% tariff, that the unilateral tariffs that the president now is threatening to apply. And again, he told us a long time ago that Lottie Dottie and everybody was going to be running to our shores, knocking down our doors to get these deals done. And I don't know that a deal's been done to date, which now means he's reverted to threatening Japan and South Korea. Talk to us, Dr. Wolff.
All right. He has signed deals with Britain. He signed deals with Vietnam. And there was the announcement of a deal with China. But you're right. Beyond that, it's all BS, promises, gestures, and now these acts. We don't know what happened in the deal with China. All the details there have not been released. So who knows? The Vietnam thing is very strange and has a number of areas where it's very hard. I've looked at it to get a clear idea. And England, well, England is a lapdog. England is now a place where the United States says jump, and their leaders only ask one question: how high? Other than that, you're signing a deal with England means you're signing a deal with yourself, which is not much of an achievement. So you're quite right, Wilma. He hadn't done much. But then again, let's remember, he promised that the war in Ukraine would be over in a week, or I believe even once in a day. Here we are 6 months in, and no way is that war over, or even less than it was then. The only thing you can say that has changed from the time he became president on the 20th of January to today is that the Russians are much further west than they were back then, which means they're winning and the Ukraine is losing with all of its support. And he's pulling out, or at least he says he's pulling out over the last few days. If he intended to bring the horror in Gaza to an end, clearly he hasn't done that. It's not even clear that the so-called ceasefire will actually hold. It's only 2 or 3 days old. He said he could solve that problem in a week. So I'm not all that surprised. He now says the deadline, last time I looked, is August 1st. So it's pushed forward yet again. And then the thing you bring up, which is in a way mysterious. And let me say something about putting a 25% tariff on Japan and South Korea. For the last half century, actually it's closer to 75 years, those two countries have been among the most solid allies of the United States across the board, in politics, in culture, in ideology, in economics, you name it, they did it. Back in the 70s and 80s, when the Japanese had figured out how to produce better quality automobiles at a lower price than the Europeans or the Americans could match, the United States asked them to voluntarily limit exports to the United States to a certain number, the quota system, it was called. And they did that. And they did it for years. What's the reward for them? And by the way, Mr. Trump wants them to be allies in confronting China, which is defined as our great adversary in Asia. And what is he doing? Hitting them with 25% tariffs. This is economic warfare. This is turning on two of your most steadfast allies and punching them economically right in the nose. And they're going to be very upset. This is costing them huge amounts of money at a time when both of their economies have problems of their own. This is, again, as far as I can see, the process in which pretending to be the bully of the world, like the U.S. once was back in the 1980s and 70s. But that period is over. And all it is doing now is isolating the United States.
And I want to just quickly go back to a comment you made about Ukraine continuing to move westward. And you went from that to the whole issue with Iran. These are issues, these are conflicts that, for all intents and purposes, the United States has either brought upon itself or exacerbated itself. Putin doesn't want to move westward. The United States is leaving him no choice. He says, as long as you want to drag this fight out, I will continue to fight. I will continue to take territory. When you all decide you want to stop this mess, I'll be more than happy to oblige. When we look at what's happening with Iran, the United States has enabled the Zionist colony of Israel to attack Iran and to attack Lebanon. This didn't have to happen. That's why we're supposed to have a Department of State, which is supposed to engage in diplomacy and is supposed to engage in negotiation. But now it appears as though the Department of State has become a vassal or an appendage of the Department of Defense.
And yes, you know, I hate to do this, but really the English language requires it. A Department of Defense. Why are we calling it that? We attacked Iran. The point about Iran, it wasn't attacking us. It wasn't shooting at us, bombing us, or anything else, or anything like that.
No.
And it had been attacked by Israel at least as much as we then attacked it. Why do we call it a defense? Why aren't we a little more honest? You know, the British used to call what they had the War Department. That's more accurate, you know, than the Department of Defense. We are not defending. The irony of Mr. Trump running for office as the man who's going to, let's remember, end the endless wars. At the time he said that, the U.S. was at war indirectly in Ukraine and indirectly in Gaza. All he's really done is added another one in Iran while shaking his sword at the Chinese about Taiwan. You begin to wonder, is he not only not ending the wars, but adding to them?
Let me go quickly to a Raphael Ellington and thank Raphael for that $20 super sticker. Greatly, greatly appreciate that contribution. Thank you so much. Now, let me go to a question that we were talking about before we were talking about offline, and that is the projected impact of Trump's attack on working class immigrants. What is that? What impact is that going to have on our labor force and on our tax base? Because we saw a video of ICE agents running through agricultural fields in California, chasing immigrants. We know not only California, but Washington State, where a lot of our fruit, where our apples and pears and other things come from. So when you look at this attack on immigration, as an economist, what do you see this doing to our labor force? And what do you see us doing? What do you see this doing to our tax base? Because a lot of people forget that even these illegal immigrants pay taxes.
Right. Well, you know, the impacts are many, and they will be lasting for many, many years. We are now only at the beginning. So when I answer your question, please understand it's going to get worse in the months and years ahead, unless, of course, he changes his policy. So let's begin. Undocumented immigrants are a very important part of the American economy, but in a very particular way. Are they a big enough group to really shape our economy? No, they are not, and they never have been. We are an economy of 330 million Americans as a population. We have 160 million in what we call the labor force. And the total number of undocumented immigrants estimated to be in this country is 11 million persons. So no way does an 11 million tail wag a 330 million dog. That's getting it confused. It's the other way around. And when you add that these immigrants, the undocumented, are among the poorest people in the world, their ability to shape our huge and successful economy over much of our history, that's just silly. And you know what that is? That's scapegoating. That's finding someone to unload your troubles on who has, in fact, very little to do with them. Next point. They are important in certain particular industries. In, as you put it, agriculture. That's a big employer of undocumented immigrants. The restaurant, or what we euphemistically call the hospitality industry, hotels, restaurant, they are a major employer. Food processing of all kinds, including fast food joints that finally sell it. But I'm talking about butchering and all of that. These are some of the industries where there are large numbers of them. But now people have to understand, here's why. Because it is easy, and there's no polite way of saying this, it is easy to abuse an undocumented immigrant because there's nothing you can do to them that they can fight back. If you're an employer and you arrive on a Friday afternoon with checks, and you turn to the people who are undocumented and say, you'll notice your check is a little lower than it was supposed to be. I'm really sorry about that. We're working on it. I hope to get to it in the next few months. What is that undocumented worker supposed to do? Go to the police? It wouldn't dare. Go to the labor office? She wouldn't dare because she's undocumented. And the employer knows it, which means not only can you pay them bottom level wages, but you can cheat them out of them almost with impunity. And it happens all the time. So that if ICE is successful in terrorizing immigrant communities, and again, I'm not going to play around with the language, that's what ICE is for. It arrests people. It beats them up, as you can see on the videos that were shown almost every day. And that's meant to terrify them. In Los Angeles, if you talk to people from that part of the country, they'll tell you about it. Schools are reporting that the children of undocumented immigrants are not coming to school anymore because their parents are afraid that ICE will get them at their school and they'll never see them again. I mean, you're talking about the wholesale departure, which is what the point is, of these people. Now, let me say something about that. It means that the fruits, those apples and pears you mentioned, they're going to cost more because if those have to be picked, and remember, when the apple ripens, you only have a few days to pick it or else you lose the crop. So if you don't have the undocumented immigrants, you're going to have to pay American citizens, and they charge a lot more, and you can't cheat them because they will go to the police and the police will help them, or at least that's the way it's supposed to work. And the same will be true of hotels and restaurants, and the same will be true of food processors. You're going to see selective inflation of things we need because we are getting rid of these people. But I want to make one final almost appeal, Wilmer, if I can.
Mm-hmm.
The United States grew powerful and rich in the 19th and 20th century by coming up with ways to absorb waves and waves of immigrants. It was the success finding work for those people, finding housing for those people, providing the education to help them assimilate. And then we discovered that these people have all kinds of skills, work themselves to the bone, hoping to build for their children a way up. All of that, all those stories we heard growing up, those had that grain of truth. For the United States now, not only not to welcome them, forget what it says on the base of the Statue of Liberty, but to actually eject them, all that's going to do in the long run is slow the rate of growth of this country, deprive us of the extra hard work these people have been doing. You can see from the biographies of those few who we learn about that ICE has thrown out of the country. Many of them have been working here for years, being perfectly productive. The FBI tells us that the rate of crime among undocumented immigrants is lower than that among people born in the United States. And by the way, that no one should be surprised at that.
Right.
Because if you're an undocumented immigrant and you break the law and they catch you, you know what's going to happen to you. You're going to get treated worse than if you were born here. You're going to perhaps be deported, etc. They're not going to do that. It's too dangerous for them. And that's probably one of the reasons why their crime rate is lower. So blaming them, ejecting them, developing a whole new stormtrooper kind of police force to terrorize them, I think in years ahead, and not many years either, we will look back on this period of history and be aghast that we as a society watched this unfold in a way that does not make anyone proud at all.
One more point on this, and then we'll move to the big boondoggle. The economies develop out of jobs. We know, for example, that after, I can remember in the 60s growing up, the last thing you wanted was something made in Japan. That was the worst thing you could get, was something made in Japan. And then of course Sony came through and Datsun came through and so on and so forth. We started sending piecemeal assembly work to China. Well, China's economy developed to where now China doesn't want, for the most part, China doesn't want that piecemeal work anymore. They then sent it to Vietnam.
Right.
So economies develop out of particular jobs. So when you talk about Americans going into the fields and replacing Mexican labor, or going back into the hotels and replacing Mexican labor, are we really going to do that? Or has the American economy, has the American developed out of that kind of job? And that's another way of asking this question. What about the narrative that immigrants are taking American jobs?
Yeah, I used to just be amazed at the idea. First of all, let me say, so that no one is surprised, are there examples in which an immigrant comes to the country and ends up in a job that an American-born worker had before and accepts lower wages to do the job? And the answer is yes. That has always been done.
Yes.
But the blame, by the way, for that should go to the employer. It's the employer who makes the decision to
Mhm.
fire an American-born worker and to hire an undocumented immigrant. And you have to ask then the question, why would an employer do that? And the employers tell you the answer. There's no mystery here. It's because you can get away with the immigrant, pay him poorer, put him in worse working conditions, cheat him occasionally. These are things you have at least a harder time doing with an American citizen, an American-born worker. So the act that causes this problem is not the immigrant. He can't give himself the job. He comes with nothing. He
Mhm.
comes like doesn't even have the right papers. That's what it means, undocumented. And there's even a little bit of a risk. So why does the employer take that risk? Well, we all know why. Because you can rip that guy off or that woman off. She's grateful to be able to come to the hotel and make up the bed after the guests leave. And she'll work there and she'll come at the odd hours and she'll do the extra because she dare not otherwise. So this is a captive workforce. Now, I agree with workers who say we don't want to be replaced by that kind of a worker. I agree. You shouldn't be. That should not be a risk you take. And the solution then would be for rational people, we need to guarantee to everyone in this country, however they got here, a job. Then there's no issue. Then the people who have a job, who were born here, don't need to worry, let alone lose their job. They don't even have to worry about it because a job will be treated, if we did that, exactly the way we treat access to the public parks in our country. We don't say you can't come. I live in Manhattan, so you can't come to Central Park, which is the big, beautiful park in the middle of our city. Anybody can come to the park who wants to. No one asks you about your immigration papers. No one asks you any such question. It's a common community resource, and therefore people are very nice to each other in Central Park. If there's Hispanic music at the next place where I'm sitting on the lawn having a picnic, I enjoy the music. I chat with the people. The park is an area where the community, which doesn't have many opportunities anymore, actually comes together.
Mhm.
And if we made workplaces like that, so that there would be no one's losing a job. If you don't have enough jobs to go out to all the people who might want to come here, okay, then you limit the number of people that come here because you have the rule that you're not going to take someone in whom you cannot pay for work that is socially useful. That would be an honorable effect. And you know what? The whole world would understand we can't take millions, if that many want to come, because we can't adjust our work situation that quickly. But we can do it slowly, as we did it in the 19th century and as we did it for much of the 20th century. It is a failure of our system that we can't absorb all those people. And one more thing, Will, because I don't want to talk too much, but this is really important. There's something that, as an economist, I have been taught to recognize. A 20-year-old person, and many of the immigrants are in their 20s or 30s, a 20-year-old person coming from, I don't know, Guatemala or Mexico or Nigeria, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
They have been nurtured, they've been fed, they've been clothed, they've been housed, and they've been educated at the expense of another country. Normally, if that were an American, we as a culture would have had to pay the cost of raising them to age 20. But we don't have to because they're immigrants. They come and their country of origin paid for their education and their upbringing. We just get them in the prime of their productive age. In their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, they're going to give us their work. We didn't have to pay to get them ready to do it. It's a way that immigrants, here we go now, subsidize our standard of living, and they always have. We're just shooting ourselves in the foot by not letting that happen. It is, for those of us who understand it, it's watching the United States in a kind of paroxysm, a hysteria that it's no longer the big tough empire it once was, and it isn't. Wanting someone to blame for that and deciding to pick on what you might call the weakest link, the poorest folks, streaming into the United States because the conditions in their own communities are unbearable, like immigrants always came. And instead of welcoming them, which we could, and using their productivity, which we used to do, we eject them. We take them in and then throw them out, treating them and their children in ways that no Christian, Jewish, or Muslim ethics I ever heard of would justify.
And to that point, I think you touched on this, but I always feel compelled to drive the point home. You talk about the circumstances in their own countries. What is the United States doing to decimate those economies? What has the United States been doing since the 1950s to overthrow the socialist, many of them socialist governments, and decimate the economies in those countries so that people have to come here? Look, when J.D. Vance talked about those Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, eating people's pets, nobody asked the question, why are the Haitians there and not eating pets in Haiti? Which, of course, we know is a lie. But why aren't they staying in Haiti eating their own dogs? Why are they in Springfield, Ohio, eating Ohioans' dogs? Nobody talks about that part of the equation, Dr. Wolff.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could not agree more. And by the way, this is as old a story. This is hundreds of years old. I mean, much of the movement of people is a result, one way or another, of what has a name, and the name is colonialism. The Europeans went and carved up most of the rest of the world into countries they then ripped off. They took the minerals from the soil, the metals from below the soil. They grew whatever they needed to have grown, all the rest of it. We know that. And then when millions of people in those parts of the world suffered as a result and moved, they often moved to the countries that were colonizing them. That's why you find Indian and Pakistani people in England, for example, or Turkish people in Germany, and all the rest. And why we find, our neighbors who we treated in less than a decent way coming here in large numbers. But Americans like to blame, but not ask the question you ask, why are they coming? For fear, and I think half of the American people know what I'm about to say, that the United States bears a lot of the responsibility for what happened in those countries. We have this thing called the Monroe Doctrine that was passed back in 1830, and it was a deal. The British had wanted to stop the United States as a colony from breaking away from the British Empire. And we fought the War of Independence, that we just celebrated over the last weekend. And that wasn't even enough. We had to fight a second war with Britain in 1812. And then finally, the British got the idea. You can't win in the United States. They're going to beat you. So a deal was arranged. The United States could become the colonial power for all of the Western Hemisphere, and Britain would take, I kid you not, the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, and all the rest of it. Outrageous behavior, but that's what they did back in what I guess is the good old days that MAGA wants to return us to. But in any case, we got to Latin America, and America became, the US, very proud of how it dominated that part of the world in just the way the English dominated India, Africa, and all the rest. So you got to be, if you're going to be proud of what you did there for a century and a half since 1830 or more, well, then you got to also take responsibility when it turns out that much of what you did created conditions that make life there impossible. And those people who come tell you the story, and the news covers the story. Anyone who wants to can find out why those people come here. You know, my parents, and I'm part of my passion, you'll know, my parents were immigrants. They had to rip up all of their lives. In my case, they were Europeans, but they left their community, they left their family, they left their schooling. They didn't want to do that. They came because it was unbearable where they were, and they wanted another chance. You know, that doesn't make you a criminal. Yes, maybe you didn't fill out all the right forms. Maybe your English isn't so good. All the rest, I get that. And I'm not saying you can't have rules about who comes in. But we waived those rules for many, many decades. And I'm not even talking about the slaves who had no say at all in what happened to them. And they were dragged into this situation and often made to do what undocumented workers are made to do and treated accordingly. All of this is stuff we ought to face up to. It wouldn't make it easy then to blame, to scapegoat the immigrant the way we're doing in this culture. It will one day mean that even Republicans and even conservatives will look back on what we're doing now and say to themselves, shame on them, shame on us.
And, you know, you mentioned coming here without following the rules doesn't make you a criminal.
No.
It actually doesn't, because it's a misdemeanor. When you, it's not, folks really need to understand that if you come across the border and you don't check all the boxes, or you don't check any boxes, it's a misdemeanor. Just keep that in mind. Let me say to Cherie, thank you very much for joining us today, being a member of the Connecting the Dots Club. As I'm not going to butcher your last name, so don't, no disrespect on my not mentioning it. I don't want to butcher your last name. Thank you for being a member. And you make the point, we have the exact same problem here in the UK because of Brexit. All the Eastern European workers no longer come to the UK because of racism. That's a very, very important point. So again, thank you very much. Kevin Baptiste, thank you for being a member. I'm just shouting some of y'all out for joining the Connecting the Dots Club. Greatly appreciate you all doing so. So now, Dr. Wolff, Trump's big bill, which I consider to be the big boondoggle, because really it is just a huge transference of wealth from the bottom to the top. Right. There's a piece in the Guardian. Trump's big bill achieved what conservatives have been trying to do for decades. The Republican fantasy of lower taxes and hard to access social safety net programs will now be a reality. I really appreciate the title of this article because it puts it in the in the context of conservative, not in the context of Republican versus Democrat.
Yeah, I saw that article too. Let me, however, correct the article in one way.
Okay.
The article is right. This is another milestone in the redistribution of wealth from the bottom and the middle to the top. People should understand that the one big economic achievement of the first Trump presidency was the big tax cut of December 2017. That was a big step in redistributing wealth from the bottom and the middle to the top.
Mm-hmm.
When conservatives talk about how they're against wealth redistribution, what they mean is they don't want to see it redistributed in the other direction, from the top to the middle and the bottom. They do not complain when it goes the other way, which it has been doing for the last 40 years. When you think about it, the tax cut of 2017, the huge tax cut mainly to corporations and the rich that Mr. Trump and the Congress passed, you would have to say this: never did corporations and the rich, having just come off 40 years of maximum profit, of maximum stock market rise, never did corporations and the rich less need a tax cut than when Mr. Trump gave it to them. And the only thing that the rather lame Democrats were able to do, they couldn't stop it, they couldn't really change it. What they got back in 2017 was a part of the bill which said that those enormous tax cuts would expire on the 31st of December of the year 2025, this year. So they brought Mr. Trump back after 4 years of Biden to finish the job, which he just did. This bill that just passed days ago and signed by the president days ago extends the tax cuts of 2017 indefinitely into the future and adds a few more. And that's why conservatives say, aha, and the Guardian said, aha, he cut taxes. But here's the problem and the mistake. Tariffs are a tax. Mr. Trump has not cut taxes. He has cut some taxes for corporations and the rich. But here's the irony. He has jacked up taxes called tariffs. They operate exactly like a sales tax. If you had to pay $50 for a shirt from Bangladesh last week, once the tariff goes into effect, you'll have to pay $100 for that shirt. Whether you're Rockefeller or you're Rockefeller's secretary, you got to pay the same tax increase. That's a tax on all of us that will be coming into play in the months and years ahead. Both Target and Amazon and Walmart have already told us those increases in the price are coming in order for them to recoup the tariffs. So that, in fact, the conservatives have done what they really always did. They talk a big game about cutting taxes. What they mean and what they achieve is cutting taxes on them. On the rest of us, not so much.
Kevin Baptiste, thank you for that $5 super sticker. And you make the point. Professor Wolff is spot on. Settler colonialism, which could not happen without class collaboration. And Peggy Parks Miller and who is a member of the club, says, Kevin, you're a student of Dr. Gerald Horne. Obviously he is. Dr. Wolff, the point about settler colonialism and class collaboration.
Yeah, settler colonialism is what you see in Gaza. We Americans have a special, or ought to have a special understanding, because that's the history of our country. There were indigenous people, as we all know or should know, and then the Europeans came and they basically wiped them out. Yes, I know there are a few reservations, think of the very meaning of the word, that have been set aside where those folks live, usually in some of the worst conditions that we have in our country. Mm-hmm. But we killed most of them, and directly or indirectly. I'm well known for having made fun in my classes of the concept that I first discovered in a little town, Deerfield, Massachusetts. I don't know if you've ever been there in Western Massachusetts. This little town has redone its colonial history, so that if you go into the little town, the old part, the houses look the way they did back at the time of the colony, when we were a colony of Great Britain, and they have carefully reconstructed and maintained the house. Very interesting. You learn a good bit of history. But the thing that struck me were the little signs right out front of each of the houses that give you a little history. And when I first read them, I remember being a little shocked, I admit it. There I'm reading, and on January 9th of 1762, the savages entered the community and they made off with this cow and that dog, and there was an arrow into the minister's rear end, or whatever it is that happened. And I remember thinking to myself, and now repeating this story, they were there for millennia, these people. The Europeans arrived, took their land, killed large numbers of them. And who gets called a savage? The white people call the indigenous savages? It shows you when you're guilty of something and you can't face it, one of the things you do is project it onto the people you have victimized, as if you got the story backwards. They didn't savage you, Jack. You did that to them on a scale that they haven't begun to replicate. Mm-hmm. And I think that what you're seeing, the horror of what is going on in Gaza, is the kind of horror that goes with settler colonialism. Back in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, Europeans could do that. They can't do that anymore. We've had a century and a half of anti-colonialism. That's the historic era you and I, Wilmer, live in. Thank God. We are in the period of undoing the colonial, except in a few isolated places where weird circumstances make people try to do it even yet again, now that the anti-colonialism is the spirit of our time. And Israel and Gaza is that sad story. America supporting it, collaborating, as your commentator in your audience rightly says, collaborating with them means you're complicit. It means that the United States, far from learning the lesson of the horrors that were committed in the settler colonialism of the United States, instead of learning from it, is now doing it indirectly by funding and arming Israel, doing it again. It is, and I'm sure people in the future will look back and see this again as another one of those shake your head in disbelief.
There's a piece in the Washington Post. Trump's economy remains pretty strong, but some warning signs are flashing. Nearly 6 months into his second term, Trump has imposed tariffs, orchestrated a crackdown on immigration, and pushed a sweeping tax bill through Congress. The economy has remained relatively stable and upbeat under Trump, according to many metrics. But Dr. Wolff, they seem to be using, as they have been for a while, the wrong metrics,
Right.
sir.
Absolutely. I mean, that you hit it right on the head, Wilmer. If you choose your metrics, you can almost come up with anything you want. Here are some metrics that would lead you to a completely different conclusion. According to all the statistics that the government puts out, here is the distribution of wealth right now that we have achieved over the last 50 years, because it used to be much less unequal than it is now. So let me give it to you now. The bottom half of the United States, the 50% at the bottom, half our people, together own, get ready now, 2.5% of the wealth of this country. The next 40%, so 50 own 2.5% of the wealth. Now the next 40% own together about 30% of the wealth. So you add together half plus 40, that's 90%. So the overwhelming majority of us, 90% of Americans together own 1/3 of the wealth. The top 10% own the other 2/3. That is an extraordinarily unequal society. I'm being as polite as I know how. I could use harsher words, but I won't. But people should gasp when they hear such numbers. This is not a successful economy. This is a disaster of an economy. That's why we have the problems we do. That's why we have Mr. Trump. That's why we have a return of white supremacy and all kinds of strange things from a past we thought we had overcome. For most of the 20th century, the United States celebrated itself as a nation of a middle class. Yeah, a few very rich people and a very few very poor. But most of us, we were all alike in a middle class. There is no middle. The numbers I just gave you, there's no middle. The 90% are busy worrying about their economic situation. They don't have to. But if the top 10% take 2/3 of the wealth, well, then you're stuck. Then you don't have enough to be secure. You do have to worry about where your job will or won't be, where your income will or won't continue to flow. The 10%, no, they don't worry about it because they have yours, to be blunt. You don't have theirs, they got yours. You ought to wonder how in the world you call that economy strong? It's not strong. It is very weak, because a country that taught itself what to be successful is to be middle class, and then pumps the mass of his people down into a oppressed low-income class, is going to have trouble. It's going to have all kinds of rebellions, little ones, personal ones, when you go in the store, when you're working at your job, when you get irritated by a neighbor. It blows up in loneliness, in isolation, in bitterness, in overwork, in exhaustion.
So let me ask you this really, really quickly. So they in this piece in the Post, they talk about warning signs. I believe we've just blown through the warning signs, and the economy is already failing in many of the manners in which the Washington Post piece is warning us. Are we already in the recession that they keep telling us is looming on the horizon? Final question to you.
For 2/3 of our people, yes. For the 10% whose eyes are not on the factory or the office or the store. Their eyes are on their portfolio in the stock market. They keep, oh, it went up. If it went up, we got a strong economy. No, you fool, you're looking at the wrong thing. I'm reminded in the last word of a famous novel called 10 Days That Shook the World by an American journalist named John Reed. He was in Moscow and Leningrad, Petrograd, at the time of the Russian Revolution. It's in the middle of 1917, and the Bolsheviks are about to take power in the first real socialist revolution. And he writes as a journalist, meanwhile, while the revolution is being fought out, the coaches go by with the elegant people on their way to the opera. You know, Americans live in these different worlds. And for one of them, they look at their metrics and everything is wonderful. Meanwhile, the mass of the people, the anger is building. Here in New York, we just elected a socialist, you know, Zoran Mamdani. That's a sign, just like, you know, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was a sign, and Bernie's a sign, and all things are changing, and it's because in large part the economy is not the make-believe that those at the top need to tell each other every day.
And quickly to that point, folks have been asking me what I think about the outcome of that New York mayoral primary, and my answer is it's too early to tell, because we're going to have to wait to see what does the Democratic Party elite in New York do in response to the outcome of this election. Your thoughts?
You're absolutely right. Depends on how faithful Mamdani is to everything he represents and promises. He won by a lot. He defeated Mr. Cuomo, who represents the traditional elite of the Democratic Party. That was an amazing achievement. If he can get the people of New York out the way they came out for him in this primary, he will be the mayor. And then we will have the same thing you ask right in front of us to see whether we can support him in being faithful to what he has written in. It's a sign, though, if anyone needed it, that there's something terribly wrong and that people are not going to keep voting for the folks who got us into this situation. They're looking for people to get us out.
Will Mamdani become Bernie Sanders? Will they Bernie Sanders him? That's one of the questions.
Yeah.
And will he, or to your point, will he
allow it?
There you go. There you go. No placeholder. Thank you very much. Shout out to Professor Wolff. Thank you, No Placeholder, for that $5 super sticker. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. And thank you, Professor Wolff, for your time today. Really, really appreciate it. Look forward to having you back.
Okay, will do. And I really do enjoy the talks with you. I meant it at the beginning. I just want to say it again.
And I learned so much. That's why the talks get better, because I get smarter every time I talk to you. Greatly, greatly appreciate it. Look forward to having you back.
Take care, man.
You too. You too. All right, folks. Wait a minute. I think I missed something here. I think I missed something. I hope. What did I miss? Oh, okay. I missed that. Sorry about that. All right, folks. Again, got to thank Professor Richard Wolff for joining us today. Thank you all for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow. And my guest tomorrow is Timon Wallace, and we'll be talking about the book Nuclear Abolition, a Scenario. Look forward to that. It's going to be a phenomenal discussion. Timon Wallace, Timmon Wallace, Wallis, will join us tomorrow. Nuclear Abolition, a Scenario is the book. Thank you all so much for joining us today on Connecting the Dots. And follow, subscribe, leave a review, share the show, follow us on social media. All the links are below in the show description. And remember, that this is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots. Why? Because it's rhetoric free. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Have a blessed remainder of your day. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.